Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box, where today we're celebrating the life and musical memory of Kris Kristofferson, a man who brought so much happiness and fun and entertainment to so many people for so many years. Now, I always am fascinated by people who write, people who compose, because that is really the foundational block of all music. Of course, there's improvisation, but improvisation is just spontaneous composition, and composition is just isolated improvisation, if you will, over a slower period of time. So I'm always very interested to learn about songwriters and people who compose. And that is how Kris Kristofferson began in the music industry. Before the public knew his name, before his face was ubiquitous, he was writing songs, and he wrote them for many of the older country and western artists of his day, Waylon Jennings, Johnny Cash, and he had what really was a crossover hit that was more known among rock audiences than among traditional country listeners. And this was Me and Bobby McGee, that was made famous by Janis Joplin, one of her very finest songs, written, of course, by Kris Kristofferson. And it wasn't long after that that Kris decided to pursue putting his face out there. And he was more or less an instant success because he had the vibe, he had the look, he had the attitude. He was sort of the cowboy that the 70s needed, because country music has always been a very traditional sort of roots-based music. And in some ways, you could say that country and Western music have been a bit more reticent to change than other genres. And when you look at the great country and Western performers between the 40s, 50s, and 60s, the basic songwriting formula stayed the same. The general arrangements of the instruments, acoustic guitar, electric guitar, lap steel guitar, pedal steel guitar, bass, sometimes upright, sometimes electric. The basic format, the costumes, because that is important in country as it is in other genres, more or less stayed the same. And by the 70s, a lot of these acts were continuing because country music generally, the musicians generally had a greater longevity than in other genres, for the very reason that it was always a star that was very popular, but it wasn't pop. Certainly not at that time. In the 90s, things started to change with that. Garth Brooks, Shania Twain. But at that time, there was pop music, and rock was a very prominent style of pop music, as was soul, R&B, later on in the 70s, disco. Country was always a few spaces apart, except for some of the bigger crossover artists. And one of the biggest of all was Kris Kristofferson. But unlike some of the others who crossed over simply on the merits of their songwriting, but retained their sort of country appearance and everything else, Kris Kristofferson was, like I said, he was the cowboy the 70s needed, because not only did he write great, memorable songs, but he had a look that was sort of one part grand. It was Grand Ole Opry meets Easy Rider, and it was that sort of fusion, if you will, of the rock and roll attitude and the country and western attitude that made him very popular among musicians who would be general audiences. And he came out with so many wonderful albums in the 70s. Who's to Bless and Who's to Blame from 75 is one of my absolute favorites. And he did a number of albums with the woman who was his wife at the time. And this was Rita Coolidge, very, very well known and very wonderful singer in her own right. Breakaway was a great album that the two of them did together. And of course, he did the updated 70s version of the earlier film A Star is Born. It was a very buttoned down 1940s endeavor before, and this was, shirtless 1970s fun, and even Barbara Streisand got to get down. This was decades before the Streisand effect and South Park changed people's opinions on her, but a great voice she does have. Um, I think that Kris Kristofferson is someone that will always be remembered by the people who were part of the pop music scene, mainly in the 70s and into the 80s, because that was definitely his golden period. Sunday Morning Come Down, what a great song. And the stuff that he did in the 80s that sort of revived several country music careers with the Highwaymen. And the very song Highwaymen was written by my favorite songwriter ever, Jimmy Webb. And that had Waylon Jennings, who Kris Kristofferson wrote for, and Johnny Cash, who he wrote for, and Willie Nelson, who he collaborated with a lot. So definitely check out The Highwaymen. Um, I'm not sure if young generations will really be familiar with his work as much because something interesting has happened with country and Western music. In the 90s, rather than exist adjacent to pop and sometimes crossing over into pop in terms of the popularity of certain artists because they were good songwriters, there became a conscious attempt to popify the sound of country. And because of that, even young country listeners now sometimes aren't familiar with the people who got them to where they are. But for those who know, they know, and they have enjoyed the music for a long time. Like, subscribe. We'll see you next time. Take care.